Good afternoon. My name is Donald Morrison, and I'm a member of the philosophy department and direct this Rice University lecture series on ethics, politics, and society. The lecture series is co-sponsored by the James Baker Institute and the Dean of Humanities. On behalf of all of us involved, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to all of you. As many of you know, the aim of this series is to offer members of Rice and the larger community a forum where first-rate scholars may seriously and carefully discuss important and often controversial moral, political, and social issues. Thank you for coming. No matter how distinguished our speakers are, ultimately the success of a series such as this depends on your interest and participation. A word about the format. After the lecture, there'll be about a half hour for questions and discussion, and then there'll be a reception outside. Our lecturer today, Samuel Scheffler, professor of philosophy and law at the University of California, Berkeley, is one of the most important and admired moral philosophers in the world. His first book, Rejection of Consequentialism, for one thing, made him famous, or at least famous in the world that I know for fame. He argued with subtlety and care for an intermediate position between consequentialism, more familiar to people in its form called utilitarianism, the view that in deciding how to act only consequences matter, an intermediate position between that view and various moral theories that impose strong constraints on what we morally do. His book helped reshape the field and was an instant classic. Samuel Scheffler is the best kind of moral philosopher, along one dimension at least. There are many dimensions along which you can be the best kind, in that he does important work on both the theoretical foundations of ethics, as in the rejection of consequentialism, and he also devotes substantial effort to applying moral theory to the concrete problems of our society and our world. I should also say that he draws inferences in the other direction. This is a strength, reshaping moral concepts to fit the changing circumstances in which we live. So he not only applies moral philosophy, but draws inferences back upwards. At this point, I'll skip over his 40 articles and other books by simply making a plug. His recent book, Boundaries and Allegiances, is a model of the kind of thinking to which this lecture series is dedicated. Give you Sam Scheffler.
Thank you very much, Don, for that extravagantly generous introduction. I didn't believe a word of it, but it was fun to listen to. So thank you, and thank you all for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's often said that immigration poses a threat to national identity. A country that experiences a large influx of immigrants will find it more difficult to sustain its national traditions and the practices in which they're enshrined. A country's unity is both expressed in and sustained by its citizens' shared sense of history, by their mutual recognition of national holidays, symbols, myths, and ceremonies, by their allegiance to a common set of values, and by their participation in a range of informal customs and tendencies covering virtually every aspect of life, including modes of dress, habits of thought, styles of music, humor and entertainment, patterns of work and leisure, attitudes toward sex and sexuality, and tastes in food and drink. Immigration transforms these sources of cultural unity into grounds of contention and conflict. Immigrants arrive with their own histories and traditions, customs and values, habits and ceremonies. The features and practices that define the host nation's distinctive identity, the very features that give its non-immigrant citizens the sense of belonging to a single people, are experienced by immigrants as unfamiliar at best and alienating or oppressive at worst. All too often, the symbols of inclusion and commonality are thus transformed into emblems of exclusion and discord. Once this happens, a country has in theory only two choices: It can resort to a kind of cultural apartheid, refusing to grant equal recognition or status to the traditions and practices of the newcomers, and enforcing as best it can the symbols of the old identity. Or it can abandon the old identity and reconceive itself as a multicultural society with a new pluralistic identity. In practice, of course, there's also a third option, which may be the most popular one of all. This is to avoid honestly confronting the choice between the first two options, and to muddle along trying to have it both ways, paying lip service to the ideas of pluralism and multiculturalism without abandoning the privileged position of the dominant culture and resorting to serious national soul-searching only when, periodically, the conflict simmering just below the surface of the social fabric erupts into a full-fledged crisis. Some people conclude from reflections like these that immigration must be severely limited. A country need not apologize, they believe, for its desire to sustain its distinctive national culture and identity, so long as that culture is not intrinsically unjust or oppressive. And since large-scale immigration threatens a country's ability to sustain its national identity, a society may legitimately impose strict limits on the number of immigrants it will accept. Other people argue, by contrast, that limiting immigration is neither feasible nor desirable, and that nations must abandon their old identities, which are often largely fictional constructions in any case, in favor of newer, genuinely multicultural forms of self-understanding. For myself, I agree that immigration poses many challenges, both practical and theoretical, which host societies can ill afford to ignore. Yet I'm uneasy about the tendency, which is by now nearly universal, to frame those challenges, as I've so far been doing, using the discourse of national identity, national culture, and multiculturalism. I've come to think that this discourse encourages a way of thinking about the challenges of immigration that's in some respects oversimplified and in other respects distorted. In this talk, I want to explain the sources of my uneasiness. Let me begin with a story drawn from my own family history. In about 1911, my great-grandfather, Joseph Zuckerbrod, fearing for the future of his 14-year-old son, Yidel, my grandfather, took him to the local train station in the southern Polish territory of Galicia, then under Austrian control, and put him on a train to begin the long journey to Glasgow, where Yidel's married sister lived. Yidel never again saw his father, who died a few years later, and the pain of their separation stayed with him for the rest of his life. He made his way across Europe alone and joined his sister and brother-in-law in Glasgow. He remained there until early in 1914, when, traveling alone again, he boarded a ship bound for New York, where an older brother had settled. The ship's manifest, filed upon arrival in New York, includes a statement from the master, which asserts that, to the best of his belief, none of the aliens on board, quote, is an idiot or imbecile or a feeble-minded person or insane person or a pauper or is likely to become a public charge or is afflicted with tuberculosis or with a loathsome or dangerous contagious disease or is a person who has been convicted of or who admits having committed a felony or other crime or misdemeanor involving moral turpitude, or is a polygamist or one admitting belief in the practice of polygamy, or an anarchist, or under promise or agreement express or imply to perform labor in the United States, or a prostitute, or a woman or girl coming to the United States for the purpose of prostitution or for any other immoral purpose. The manifest also includes a notation of the race and nationality of each alien, and the accompanying instructions specify that in completing the manifest, quote, special attention should be paid to the distinction between race and nationality. The instructions go on to explain this distinction with exemplary clarity. Nationality, they specify, should, quote, be construed to mean the country of which the immigrant is a citizen or subject. Race, by contrast, should, quote, be determined by the stock from which the aliens sprang and the language they speak, end quote, although it's further explained that stock is of primary importance and that language is relevant only insofar as it may help to determine stock. Quote, the original stock or blood shall be the basis of the classification independent of language. The mother tongue is to be used only to assist in determining the original stock. A putatively exhaustive list of precisely 46 races is provided. Having been assigned a race, Hebrew, and a nationality, Austrian, and the ship's master and surgeon having certified that he did not appear to be suffering from a contagious disease or to be an idiot, imbecile, criminal, pauper, or anarchist, my grandfather was cleared to enter the United States. Years later, a stray check mark on the ship's manifest led the anonymous person entering the passengers' names into an immigration database to misread the elaborately scripted Y of my grandfather's first name as an F. And so he is listed in immigration records as having entered the country with the improbably multicultural-sounding name of Fidel Zuckerbrod. Yidel, in any case, soon gave way to Julius, and with the name Julius Zuckerbrod, my grandfather settled in New York and lived there for the rest of his long life. Although my grandfather never received a formal education, he read the newspapers avidly and took a strong interest in world affairs. Yet if someone had asked him whether it was important to him to have his culture recognized by his new country, or whether he thought the national identity of the United States should be replaced by a new multicultural identity in order to accommodate him and other immigrants, I doubt that he would have known what to say. And I doubt this not merely because the terminology would have been unfamiliar to him, and not merely because he was a quiet man who was not in the habit of talking about himself. Even if the terminology had been familiar and he'd been prepared to engage in the kind of reflection required to answer the question, I think he would have found the formulation of the question puzzling. What, to begin with, might he have seen as his culture? Not Polish culture, surely. My grandfather was not a Polish citizen. Poland was not even a state at the time. Nor was he of Polish stock. As the ship's manifest makes clear, Poles and Hebrews were taken to belong to different races. Was there such a thing as Galician culture? If so, then I'm sure that my grandfather would not have been tempted to claim it as his own. Might he have thought that his culture was the culture of the Habsburg Empire? The suggestion is comical. Perhaps, then, the most plausible suggestion is that his culture was Hebrew culture. But what is Hebrew culture? Judaism is a religion, which my grandfather took seriously, and which, like most religions, admits of many versions and variants. In addition, Jews, both religious and non-religious, have sustained a sense of themselves as a distinct people over many centuries, and of course their enemies have always been happy to reinforce that sense if it was ever in danger of waning. Yet if there is a monolithic Jewish culture, I have no idea what it is. Jews live in many different countries and participate in many different ways of life. The Jewish world, if it makes sense to talk in those terms, is notoriously variegated and even fractious. Jews are divided along lines of class, region, politics, language, ideology, skin color, sexual orientation, and religious practice and interpretation. They display wildly divergent attitudes toward Judaism as a religion, toward each other, and toward their own Jewishness. Whatever it is that Jews may be said to have in common, I'm sure that it does not add up to a complete culture. So what, to repeat, might my grandfather have seen as his culture? It may be suggested that even if there is no common culture that all Jews share, perhaps the Jews of his time and place, Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, say, did share a culture. However, although it may seem natural today to speak of Eastern European Jewish culture, this way of speaking seems to me to owe a great deal to a combination of simple ignorance and gauzy post-Holocaust sentimentality. Even a glancing familiarity with the history of the Jews of Eastern Europe makes it evident that there were profound differences of many different kinds among and within the Jewish communities in that part of the world. This is true even of the Jews of Galicia. Yet it's also true that Galician Jews were often regarded by other Eastern European Jews as forming a recognizable group or type. So perhaps, despite my reservations, this is as close to an answer as we can come. Perhaps my grandfather's culture was the culture of Galician Jews. But if that was his culture, then two facts seem striking. The first is that he, like so many other Galician Jews, took great risks and endured painful separations in order to uproot himself from Galicia and to begin a new life elsewhere. Furthermore, and this is the second point, there's no indication that something called Galician Jewish culture was a salient category for him, still less that it was something he wanted recognized and preserved in the United States. To be sure, my grandfather wanted to live freely and without fear of persecution, and he wanted to be able to practice his religion as he saw fit. And he certainly wanted to maintain family relations and to reestablish family networks that were disrupted by mass migration. Furthermore, many of his personal tastes, habits, and customs carried over from Galicia to New York. The formative influence of his upbringing in the old country did not simply disappear upon arrival in the New World. Immigration is not amnesia, and it does not wipe the slate clean. But immigration does involve change. That's the point. And my grandfather, who as a teenager traveled halfway around the world by himself to begin a new life, knew that as well as anyone. The life he made for himself was a life in New York, not in Galicia, and that, I assume, was how he wanted it. And if some of the customs and practices of his Galician past persisted, many others gave way to the new customs and practices that he inevitably acquired in his new surroundings. If, upon meeting him later in his life, you had been asked to say what his culture was, you would have been unlikely to say that it was Galician Jewish culture. You might have been tempted to say that it was New York Jewish culture, although that phrase conjures up a stereotype that in many ways he did not fit, and once again there's no evidence that it picks out a category that he operated with or cared about. More to the point, this culture could hardly have been one that he brought with him to New York from Glasgow and Galicia, or whose preservation might have been of concern to him upon his arrival in the United States. If it was his culture at all, it was a culture that he acquired as the result of immigration. Indeed, if there is such a thing as New York Jewish culture, then it's a culture that was created by immigration. If the Jewish immigrants who settled in New York had simply brought a fixed and determinate culture with them, and if the United States had somehow contrived to preserve that culture unaltered, then New York Jewish culture would never have existed. In expressing doubts about what my grandfather might have taken his culture to be, I do not mean to suggest that he was a so-called cosmopolitan, or that he lacked particular loyalties and allegiances. Nothing could be further from the truth. After the upheavals of his youth, he seldom traveled outside of New York. A man of great warmth and humor, he led a stable life that was firmly embedded in a web of family and communal relations, and in which Jewish religious practice and observance continued to play an important role. There's no doubt that his identification of himself as a Jew and his sense of solidarity with the Jewish people were fundamental to his self-understanding. My point is not that he was so sophisticated and worldly that he transcended his culture. It's rather that despite his strong family religious and communal allegiances, it's not clear that he ever had, still less that he brought with him from Galicia, a single fixed and determinate culture. My grandfather's story is not extraordinary, except in the sense in which every immigrant's story is extraordinary. But I believe that it suggests some broad lessons and that it helps to reveal some of the limitations of some recently popular ways of thinking about immigration. The first lesson has to do with the difficulty and the danger of trying to identify for each immigrant a single culture to which that individual belongs. Many others have warned eloquently against the twin tendencies to reify cultures and to assign each individual to a single culture. Sometimes these warnings emphasize the emergence of new, distinctively cosmopolitan ways of living and hybrid forms of identity, which are contrasted with more traditional ways of life, and which are said to imply that some individuals cannot be assigned to any single, relatively homogeneous culture. I take my grandfather's story to suggest a different and more far-reaching point, though also one for which I claim no originality, which is that even for people whose lives may seem superficially to be assimilable within some fixed cultural framework, the appearance of cultural fixity and determinacy is often illusory. This point does not apply only to immigrants, and it does not depend on a person's having undergone the changes that immigration by definition involves, although the fact that immigrants must undergo such changes suggests that the point holds even more strongly for them. But the basic point has wider application. Most individuals in modern societies belong to groups of many different kinds. They participate in practices, customs, and traditions of very different provenance, and they have tastes, interests, and affinities in common with different sets of people. Which of these multiple affiliations is salient, even for the individual himself, can vary depending on the context. Consider a simple example. From a European standpoint, it may seem natural to speak of American culture, and for an American who's traveling in Europe, his status as an American may seem especially salient. Yet in other contexts, this same person may feel, or be told, that he is part of Western culture, where the West is taken to comprehend both Europe and North America. And on the other hand, when this same American is in the United States, famously in the throes of its so-called culture wars, his status as a resident of one of the blue states, as a Californian, for example, may at times seem more salient than his identity either as an American or as someone who belongs to Western culture. But it doesn't stop there. A Northern Californian and a Southern Californian may feel that they share a strong cultural bond if they meet in Appalachia or Addis Ababa, but Northern Californians who visit Southern California often profess to find it culturally alienating, to put it mildly, and vice versa. Moreover, neither of these regions is itself culturally monolithic. Indeed, there are significant cultural differences even between the neighboring Northern California university towns of Berkeley and Palo Alto. And I've so far said nothing of those many identifications and allegiances which cut across and transcend regional and political boundaries. Identifications and allegiances based, for example, on class, religion, occupation, race, gender, or sexual orientation. Yet it's obvious that there are contexts in which one's identity as a Catholic, a physicist, a trade unionist, a black man, a soldier, or a lesbian may loom larger than any identification based on region or citizenship. And then there are identifications or cultural affinities based on shared interests in music, painting, literature, or other forms of artistic activity or appreciation, or on a shared commitment to a cause like environmentalism, vegetarianism, or pacifism, or on a shared passion for railroads or slow food or a particular football team, or for mountain climbing, surfing, or playing bridge. All of these identifications and passions and affiliations and countless others are aspects of human culture, and to live a human life is to trace a particular path through the space of possibilities they define. Admittedly, some people explore that space more intrepidly than others, and few people regard all of their identifications and affiliations as equally significant. For some people, there's a single affiliation that is central to their sense of themselves, while for others there may be a small number of such affiliations. Yet to insist that for each individual there must be some one identification that corresponds to his or her real culture is to misunderstand both identity and culture. Identity is a protean notion. Most people have multiple identifications, and even though some of those identifications are likely to be more central to their sense of themselves than others, people's perceptions of the relative importance or salience of their various identifications are almost always context-dependent to some degree. People's identifications are also subject to change over time, and even strong identifications sometimes change or fade away. Moreover, the idea that each person's most fundamental identification or identifications must have their source in some fixed and determinate culture is simply untrue. For these reasons, the prospect of having the state assign each individual to a single culture chosen from a fixed menu of options based on geography, religion, skin color, or language should strike us as badly misguided. It is misguided first because of its self-fulfilling character. There's no surer way to make a particular form of group affiliation a dominant feature of individual identity than for the state to make it the ascriptive basis for the assignment of legal status. And it's also misguided because it can so easily degenerate into an illiberal and oppressive attempt to confine each individual, politically and legally, within some rigidly defined region of social space. The second lesson has to do not with the relation between individuals and cultures, but with the nature of immigration. The reasons why people leave one country for another vary, as do the reasons why host countries accept new immigrants. But as I've already said, immigration always involves change. That's the point of it. It changes the immigrants and it changes the host country. This means that it cannot be the aim of a reasonable immigration policy to insulate either the host country or the new immigrants against cultural change. To think that we must choose between preserving the national culture of the host country and preserving the imported culture of the immigrants is to accept a false dilemma. The truth is that we cannot preserve either of them. Or at any rate, we cannot preserve either of them in unaltered form. And this is so even if we suspend the doubts I've been expressing about whether it's appropriate to think of each individual as having a single determinate culture. Even if, for the sake of argument, we suspend our challenge to that assumption, the fact remains that neither the immigrant's culture nor the national culture can be preserved unaltered. Of course the immigrant's culture, their practices, customs, ways of living, will change. It will change because their new society presents them with a new predicament. They must come to terms with new rules, new options, new neighbors, new institutions, new history, new ideas, new customs, new values, new modes of dress, new climate, new cuisine, new tastes, new expectations, new language. How could their ways of living possibly be unaffected by these changes in their social and geographical surroundings? Even if they adopt as radically isolationist or separatist a stance as they can muster and as the new society will allow, their way of life will now be shaped by the need to insulate themselves against these options, neighbors, ideas, customs, modes of dress, expectations, values, and so on. And that means that their culture will change. It will change because changing is what cultures do when they confront new situations. And immigration, by definition, presents immigrants with a new situation. Equally, however, the national culture will change. It will change because the introduction into society of a new set of people presents the old residents, the putative bearers of the national culture, with a new predicament. They must come to terms with the presence in their midst of new neighbors, new customs, new ideas, new values, new modes of dress, new expectations, new languages, new cuisine, new tastes. And even if they adopt as radically exclusionary a stance as they can muster, their way of life will now be shaped by the need to exclude these neighbors' ideas, customs, modes of dress, expectations, values, and so on. And this means that the national culture will change. It will change because changing is what cultures do when they confront new situations, and immigration, by definition, presents the host society with a new situation. For cultural preservationists, for those concerned to preserve either the pre-existing culture of the immigrants or the national culture of the host country, these reflections may seem to support a rejectionist attitude toward immigration. If immigration inevitably brings cultural change, then it may seem the lesson for the first kind of preservationist is that prospective immigrants should stay put, and the lesson for the second kind is that prospective host countries should refuse to accept those who do not. But wholesale rejectionism is not a tenable attitude. It's not tenable because it fails to engage with the compelling reasons that immigrants usually have for migrating, or with the compelling reasons that host countries usually have for accepting them. And more fundamentally, it's not tenable because it rests on a misunderstanding of the nature and prospects of cultural preservation. Suppose that our country were today to seal its borders and reduce to zero the number of immigrants that it accepted. The fact remains that within a relatively short period of time, let's be very optimistic and say 150 years, every single one of the country's current residents will be dead. If the country survives, it will be populated entirely by people who are as yet unborn, immigrants from the future, if you like. Do we really suppose, or could we really wish, that despite undergoing a complete population replacement, our country's national culture might remain exactly the same in 150 years as it is today? To think that this is either possible or desirable is to imagine nothing at all happening in or to the country in the intervening period. No new ideas, no new challenges, no new discoveries or inventions, no advances in science or medicine or technology, no new works of literature or art or music, no new heroes or villains, no changes in fashion or style or entertainment, no new achievements, no new successes, no new failures. It is, in short, to imagine that our successors might not actually lead human lives, that history might simply be frozen, that our country might go on functioning with a past but no future. If cultural preservation is to be a reasonable or even a coherent goal, it cannot possibly mean this. Cultures survive only by changing, by accumulating and interpreting and producing new ideas and experiences. There is no other way. So to the extent that the impulse behind blanket rejectionism is to preserve a culture by preventing it from changing, it's fundamentally misguided. To this point, I've warned against an oversimplified understanding of the relation between individuals and culture, and I've argued that immigration inevitably changes both the culture of the immigrants and the culture of the host country. This suggests that there's no general right of immigrants to resist changes demanded by the host society whenever those changes would conflict with the norms or practices of the immigrant's culture. But it also suggests that there's no general right of the host society to impose constraints on new immigrants whenever this is thought necessary to protect the national culture from change. These points serve to undermine strong preservationist claims, whether on behalf of immigrant culture or on behalf of national culture. However, they take us only so far. They don't tell us, for example, whether there are any demands for cultural change that new immigrants are entitled to resist, or any that the host society is entitled to insist on. The general tenor of my remarks may seem to support negative answers to these questions. The spirit of those remarks suggests a general position that might be described as Heraclitean pluralism. Heraclitean pluralism asserts that culture and cultures are always in flux, and that individuals normally relate to culture through the acknowledgement of multiple affiliations and allegiances, and through participation in diverse practices, customs, and activities, rather than through association with some one fixed and determinate culture. It further asserts that in light of these facts, states should be maximally accommodating of the cultural variety that free individuals will inevitably exhibit, without seeking to constrain that freedom in the misguided attempt to preserve some particular culture in the form that it happens to take at a given historical moment. It's important to see that there's room within Heraclitean pluralism for a certain kind of conservative or traditionalist project. Most human beings have strong conservative impulses, in the sense that they have strong desires to preserve what they value, including what they value about past and present practices and ways of life. As we've already seen in the case of strong preservationism, these impulses sometimes issue in support for foolish or even dangerous policies based on false or incoherent ideas about the possibility of inhibiting cultural change. However, the problem with these policies lies not in the conservative impulse itself, but rather in the assessment of how best to act on it. In fact, it's difficult to understand how human beings could have values at all if they did not have conservative impulses. What would it mean to value things, but in general to see no reason of any kind to sustain them or retain them or preserve them or extend them into the future? Even people who claim that they live only for the moment, that they value only momentary experiences, presumably value and wish to sustain a life that is rich in the right kind of momentary experiences. And even radicals who wish to overturn the established order seek to entrench the values that animate their revolutionary ambitions. If there is a conceptual gap between valuing and the impulse to conserve, it's not a very large one. For this reason, it would be fatal to Heraclitean pluralism if it could not in any way accommodate the impulse to conserve valued traditions, customs, practices, and modes of living. However, the failure of strong preservationism helps point the way toward an alternative strategy of accommodation that's compatible with Heraclitean pluralism. Strong preservationism fails as a strategy for accommodating the conservative impulse because it fails to recognize that change is essential to culture and to cultural survival, so that to prevent a culture from changing would not be to preserve the culture, but rather to destroy it. But this suggests that, paradoxical though it may sound, the right way to preserve a culture is to allow it to change. Of course, not every change in a culture will preserve it, and merely allowing a culture to change does not guarantee that the culture will survive. Nothing can guarantee that. Still, what it takes for a culture to survive is for an ever-changing but sufficiently large and continuous group of people to use enough of the culture's central ideas, practices, values, ideals, beliefs, customs, texts, artifacts, rites, and ceremonies to structure sufficiently large portions of their lives and experiences. And structuring one's life in this way does not involve the algorithmic application of the culture's values and ideals to new situations, nor the uncritical and unrevisable adherence to its ideas and beliefs, nor the exact reproduction of its ceremonies and practices and customs in precisely their original form. What it involves instead is the use of judgment and intelligence in interpreting the relevance of older values and ideals for novel problems and predicaments, in deciding how the culture's traditional ways of thinking can best be extended so as to assimilate the never-ending accumulation of new historical experience, and in deciding which influences from other cultures are to be welcomed and which are not. This means that the survival of a culture is an ongoing collective achievement which requires the exercise of judgment, creativity, intelligence, and interpretive skill. It also requires a healthy dose of good luck, for whether a culture will survive depends on whether its resources, effectively developed, are well suited to dealing with the contingent and ever-changing historical circumstances that the culture actually confronts. But one thing is certain: any culture that survives will have changed over time. It will have assimilated new experiences, absorbed new influences, reaffirmed some prior practices and ideas, modified others, and dispensed altogether with still others. Survival is successful change. A reasonable cultural preservationism strives to achieve such change rather than seeking to preserve the past unaltered. This explains why I said there's room within Heraclitean pluralism for a certain kind of conservative or traditionalist project. Although it's opposed to any strong preservationist attempt to preserve a particular culture in the form that it happens to take at a given historical moment, Heraclitean pluralism has no quarrel with the desire to preserve a culture per se. Inasmuch as it seeks to accommodate cultural variety and change, it's hospitable in principle to the kind of change in which cultural preservation, properly understood, consists. Heraclitean pluralism asserts that the best way of accommodating the conservative impulse in general is also the best way of accommodating reasonable preservationist projects, namely by giving individuals the freedom to structure their lives with reference to a diverse array of values, practices, and ideas. What exactly is the bearing of Heraclitean pluralism on questions of immigration? As I've said, immigration inevitably alters the cultural landscape both for the immigrants themselves and for the host society. There is no possibility of preserving unaltered either the imported culture of the immigrants or the national culture of the host society, and neither the immigrants nor the host society has any general right to such preservation. As I noted, however, these observations take us only so far. They leave open the question of whether there's anything that immigrants may demand of the host society, or that it may demand of them, in the name of cultural preservation. I should say parenthetically that in addressing this question, I'm going to limit my remarks to cases of lawful immigration. Some of what I say may also be relevant to unlawful immigration, but unlawful immigration raises separate issues that I won't try to discuss here. Heraclitean pluralism delivers a negative answer to the question I've raised. What immigrants may demand of the host society, it asserts, is justice, where justice is understood not to include any special cultural rights, entitlements, or privileges. Justice does include the basic rights and liberties, including freedom of thought, expression, association, and conscience, that are familiar from liberal theory. It also includes, let's suppose, fair equality of opportunity and some conception of the just distribution of economic resources. Heraclitean pluralism asserts that a just social framework, understood in this way, gives ample scope for immigrants to pursue reasonable preservationist projects. Within a structure of laws that themselves conform to the principles of justice, immigrants may take full advantage of their rights, liberties, opportunities, and economic resources to develop and extend inherited practices, customs, ideals, and traditions. What they cannot do is to demand additional rights or resources beyond those they're owed as a matter of justice in the name of cultural preservation specifically. By the same token, however, there's nothing that the host society may legitimately demand of immigrants in the name of preserving the national culture. What it may legitimately demand of them is that they live peacefully in society and uphold the duties and obligations of citizens. These include the familiar duties to obey just laws, pay taxes, and the like, but they do not include any obligation to preserve or participate in the historical culture of the nation per se. Individual citizens may, of course, pursue reasonable preservationist projects with respect to the national culture, but they cannot use the coercive power of the state to require others to support those efforts, and laws that have this aim or effect are unjust. Understood in this way, Heraclitean pluralism is even-handed in its refusal to endorse special state protections aimed at preserving a particular culture or cultures. Neither the national culture nor any immigrant culture should receive such protection. Within an egalitarian, liberal framework, individuals are free to structure their lives in accordance with inherited traditions of practice and conviction as they see fit, provided that they fulfill their duties as citizens and do not violate the rights of others. So on the one hand, immigration inevitably changes both the culture of the immigrants and the culture of the host country, and neither of them can or should be immunized against change. Yet on the other hand, change is compatible with cultural survival and renewal, and in a just society, immigrants and non-immigrants alike will have the freedom and the opportunity to engage in the dynamic and interpretive process of extending their inherited cultures in the altered circumstances to which immigration gives rise. Now, I have a great deal of sympathy for Heraclitean pluralism. However, I don't think it provides a fully satisfactory way of thinking about issues of immigration and culture. Its limitations are most apparent in its attitude toward national culture. As I've said, the Heraclitean position is that the power of the state may not be used to coerce citizens into supporting reasonable efforts to preserve the national culture. The problem with this is that the state cannot avoid coercing citizens into preserving a national culture of some kind. To begin with, the institutions of state and their laws and policies themselves define a political and civic culture, or what John Rawls called a public political culture. And that culture in turn shapes and constrains the conduct of daily life in countless ways. In effect, then, the political and civic culture serves partly to constitute and partly to shape a broader national culture, and in demanding obedience to its laws and support for its institutions, the state is, in effect, requiring citizens to contribute to the preservation of that culture. For this reason, the national culture has a different status than other cultural traditions that may be represented within the society. It cannot be treated by the state as just one culture among others, nor can the state be expected to refrain from deploying its coercive power in support of a national culture. Nor is it reasonable to insist that the content of the public political culture should be determined solely by universal moral or constitutional principles that treat all citizens as equals and should not contain any distinguishing ethnic or linguistic or particularistic elements. A country is a contingent historical formation. The history of any country is also the history of particular people, of its original population and their successors over time, with their contingent array of practices, affiliations, customs, values, ideals, and allegiances. Inevitably, elements of that array will help to shape the character of those basic social, political, and legal institutions that serve to enforce the political and civic culture. They're likely to influence everything from the choice of official languages, national holidays, and public monuments and ceremonies to the regulation of work, education, and family arrangements. In enforcing the political culture, then, and so in shaping the broader national culture, the state will inevitably be enforcing a set of practices and values which have their origins in the contingent history and traditions of a particular set of people. This is not in itself inappropriate, and there's in any case no alternative. The state can neither avoid promoting a national culture nor invent that culture ab initio. There is an important difference in this regard between religion and culture. A state need not recognize an official religion, but it cannot avoid promoting a national culture. Where culture is concerned, neutrality is not an option. This suggests the need to modify the Heraclitean position to recognize the special place of the public political culture, to acknowledge the contingent historical circumstances that will inevitably have influenced both its form and its content, and to allow for its role in shaping a broader national culture. Although immigrants may find the public political culture alien, and although its historical roots may be remote from their own, the coercive pressure that the culture exerts is not by itself unjust. It is not by itself unjust that immigrants should be expected to obey the laws and support the institutions of their new society, even when the character and the content of those laws and institutions has been shaped in part by historical circumstances and traditions with which the immigrants have no antecedent identification. But if this suggests a modification of the Heraclitean position that works, so to speak, in favor of the host society, there are also considerations that pull the other way. First, although it's not by itself unjust that immigrants should be expected to obey the laws and institutions of their new society, it is unjust to expect them to obey gravely unjust laws or to support severely unjust institutions, especially if the burdens imposed by those laws and institutions fall primarily on the immigrants themselves. Nor is it enough that the laws should be just. They must also be applied impartially to immigrants and others alike. Immigrants are entitled to the equal protection of the laws, and they cannot be expected to acquiesce in the denial of equal protection or in unjust treatment more generally. Second, the principles of justice may themselves require, by virtue of their guarantees of liberty of conscience and association, that certain limited exemptions from otherwise just laws should be provided to people for whom compliance would conflict with deeply held conscientious convictions, whether religious or non-religious in character. To the extent that this is so, the conscientious convictions of immigrants must be considered on the same footing as those of non-immigrants, and must be judged by the same criteria. They, too, must be eligible for whatever exemptions or other forms of legal accommodation justice requires. Third, it's not quite true that what the society owes its immigrants is justice and nothing more. In expecting them to accept a civic and political culture that includes many contingent elements that are not requirements of justice, the society is in effect demanding that immigrants accommodate themselves to the commitments, traditions, and values of the pre-existing population. If a society is conceived of as a fair system of cooperation among free and equal people with diverse aims and values, then the willingness of people to accommodate one another will be indispensable to its successful functioning. But accommodation is not a one-way street. If, as I've been arguing, it's not in general unreasonable to expect immigrants to accommodate themselves to aspects of the national culture that are not themselves required by justice, neither is it unreasonable to expect the wider society to make some effort to accommodate the traditions, practices, and values of immigrants, even when a failure to do so would not violate any principle of justice. Here I'm thinking not of formal legal exemptions like those that may sometimes be required to accommodate religious or conscientious conviction, but rather of informal ad hoc adjustments made by individual citizens and social institutions as a way of helping new immigrants to feel at home. In general, it's essential to the successful functioning of any society that its members be prepared to accommodate one another on an informal basis in a wide range of contexts. And this willingness to engage in informal accommodation is an especially important element of a society's treatment of new members, whose place in the society might otherwise seem marginal or precarious. In this arena, as in the content of the principles of justice themselves, there's an ideal of reciprocity that a decent and well-functioning society must strive in good faith to honor, and which it ignores at its peril. Finally, the points I've made about the special role of the national culture shouldn't be understood to reinstate strong preservationism. The contingent historical character of the national culture is not in itself objectionable, and a society is not obligated to purge all of the contingent elements of the culture in order to accommodate new immigrants. On the other hand, once a society accepts immigrants as new members, then they have as much say as anyone else in shaping the future character and culture of the society. They are now part of the society and contributors to its ongoing history. They belong to the mix of people who will help to determine how the culture evolves, and it is only to be expected that large-scale immigration will lead to more or less gradual and more or less radical changes over time. The considerations I've been rehearsing suggest a number of modifications of the Heraclitean position on immigration, but they don't undercut its central claims. It's true, as the Heraclitean says, that there's no possibility of preserving unaltered either the imported cultures of immigrant communities or the national cultures of host societies, and that neither side has any general right to such preservation. It's also true that in a just society, immigrants and non-immigrants alike should have the freedom and the opportunity to engage in the dynamic and interpretive process of extending their inherited cultures in the altered circumstances to which immigration gives rise. Finally, I believe that the Heraclitean position is correct to forswear any appeal to cultural rights or to the language of multiculturalism in thinking about these questions. The constituents of political morality that are most relevant in thinking about the mutual responsibilities of immigrants and host societies are the principles of justice, which define a fair framework of social cooperation among equals and which are understood to exclude special cultural rights, the basic liberties, including especially the liberties of speech, association, and conscience, and the important idea of informal mutual accommodation within the bounds of justice. Talk of cultural rights and of multiculturalism adds little that is useful to this, and it provides an invitation to mischief, both by encouraging us to think in unsustainable, strong preservationist terms, and by promoting a distorted and potentially oppressive conception of the relations between individuals and cultures. Now, my resistance to employing the discourse of cultural rights and multiculturalism runs counter to strong currents in contemporary liberal thought. So let me try to say a bit more about the reasons for that resistance. After all, the idea of treating diversity with respect to culture as calling for explicit protection under a regime of liberal rights and toleration may seem like a natural extension of basic liberal principles. Historically, liberalism had its origins in the practice of religious toleration. Subsequent liberal theorists secularized and generalized the notion of a religious affiliation so as to accommodate commitments of a non-religious character as well. It's in this spirit that contemporary liberals emphasize diversity with respect to people's so-called conceptions of the good or comprehensive moral doctrines, which are understood to include but not be limited to distinctively religious commitments. It's in this spirit, too, that many modern liberals speak, as I've done in this talk, about freedom of conscience rather than freedom of religion, since the assumption is that a person's conscientious convictions need not have a religious character. And just as the modern liberal focus on competing conceptions of the good represents a generalization from the case of diverse religious commitments, so too the idea that liberalism should protect diverse cultures may seem like a natural next step. After all, a person's cultural affiliations may be as central to her identity as her religious commitments or her moral and evaluative convictions. And so a liberal polity that is concerned to protect fundamental human interests should be as concerned to safeguard cultural diversity as it is to protect moral, religious, and philosophical diversity. However, I believe that it's a mistake to extrapolate from the case of moral, religious, and philosophical convictions to the case of cultural affiliations. Moral, religious, and philosophical outlooks, as conceptualized within liberal theory, are explicitly justificatory structures. That is, they're systems of norms and values that provide guidance about how to live. To the extent that there's a principled liberal case for accommodating diverse outlooks of this kind, it rests on the importance to people of being free to order their lives in accordance with values and norms that they perceive as authoritative, that is, as defining the conditions of a good or worthy life. The special status of moral, religious, and philosophical doctrines derives from their role as perceived sources of normative authority. We may think of this role as follows. Many people have, and think of themselves as having, moral, religious, or philosophical convictions about how best to live. To describe these convictions as convictions is to say that those who hold them believe them to be true. And to describe them as convictions about how to live is to say that those who hold them see them as providing reasons for action. Thus, many people recognize moral, religious, or philosophical reasons for action and take the force or authority of those reasons to derive from their association with presumed moral, religious, or philosophical truths. In that sense, morality, religion, and philosophy are perceived sources of normative authority. Cultures are not, in the same sense, sources of normative authority, for they are not explicitly justificatory structures at all. As a first approximation, we may say that a culture is a web of formal and informal practices, customs, institutions, traditions, norms, rituals, values, and beliefs. Although norms and values are important aspects of all cultures, this does not mean that the role of culture is parallel to the role of moral, religious, and philosophical doctrines. To begin with, there's no need for a culture to embrace a uniform normative outlook, and many cultures exhibit a high degree of moral, religious, and philosophical diversity. Moreover, as this formulation already implies, most of the values and principles that are aspects of culture are themselves regarded by their adherents as having a moral, religious, or philosophical character. They're not thought of by those who accept them as constituting an independent normative category. So while many people have what they take to be moral, religious, or philosophical convictions, few have what they think of as cultural convictions. And while many people accept what they represent to themselves as moral, religious, or philosophical principles and defer to the authority of considerations associated with those principles, few endorse what they think of as cultural principles. Even when people realize that the principles they endorse are in fact widely shared within their culture, the authority of the principles is normally taken to derive not from their acceptance within the culture, but rather from the direct normative force of the principles themselves. It's true, of course, that we speak of cultural norms or cultural values, but these expressions are normally used in descriptive or interpretive contexts. To describe something as a cultural norm or a cultural value is not to characterize its perceived authority, but rather just to indicate its prevalence within a certain social group. Except in special cases, people who actually accept such values and norms and who feel their force don't think of them in those terms. Still less do they see the authority of the values and norms as deriving from their status within the culture. In fact, for this very reason, to describe something as being merely a cultural norm or value can sometimes be a way of debunking it, of denying that it has the kind of authority that its adherents take it to have. In short, cultures are not perceived sources of normative authority in the same sense that moral, religious, and philosophical doctrines are. Those who think of them as being on a par commit something like what philosophers call a category mistake. For culture is a descriptive, ethnographic category, not a normative one. In other words, to classify something as a moral, religious, or philosophical value or principle is to say something about the kind of authority its adherents take it to have. By contrast, to classify something as a cultural norm or value is not to characterize its perceived authority, but merely to indicate that a certain group of people subscribes to it. This explains why, although many people have what they think of as moral, religious, or philosophical convictions and regard those convictions both as true and action-guiding, few people think of themselves as having a comparable class of cultural convictions. And it explains why cultural reasons rarely feature as such in individual deliberation. From a deliberative perspective, these supposed reasons do not constitute a special class of norm or value-based considerations over and above the various norm and value-based considerations that agents already recognize. I don't mean to deny that the fact that one is associated with a particular culture may be an important aspect of one's identity. By the same token, however, a commitment to a particular moral, religious, or philosophical doctrine may also be an important aspect of one's identity. And yet these identity-based considerations are not what ground the special status of such doctrines within liberal thought. Thus, the relation between culture and identity does not support an extrapolation from the case of moral, religious, and philosophical convictions to the case of cultural affiliations. Of course, one might propose that the need to protect individual identity should be treated as an independent basis for a regime of cultural rights. However, as I argued earlier, identity is too protean and variable a notion to warrant this sort of protection. Individuals' identities are fluid, context-dependent, and mutable. In providing the familiar liberties of thought, speech, association, and conscience, a liberal society already affords individual identity the only kind of legal protection that it can or should receive. Furthermore, as I also argued earlier, the relations between individuals and cultures are complex, and it's a mistake to suppose that each individual has a single fixed and determinate culture. So if one reifies cultures as privileged sources of individual identity and seeks to protect them on that basis, the effect is to rigidify the notions of culture and identity in a way that is false to the facts and is liable to encourage illiberal social arrangements. To avoid misunderstanding, there are 2 points that I particularly want to emphasize. First, my arguments against relying on the language of culture and identity in thinking about problems of immigration should not be mistaken for a general skepticism about the moral significance of particularistic attachments and group affiliations. People's lives are enriched beyond measure by such attachments and affiliations, and the responsibilities that we acquire by participating in personal relationships and belonging to groups and associations are among the most important and deeply rooted responsibilities that we have. In these respects, personal relationships and group affiliations are of the greatest moral significance. The doubts that I've registered here have to do with the normative significance of the concept of culture in particular, and with the idea that cultural preservation as such is a goal that the state should take special measures to advance or achieve. Second, although I've argued that cultures are not explicitly justificatory structures in the same sense that moral, religious, and philosophical outlooks are, I don't mean to deny, indeed I wish to insist, that cultures include normative materials of many different kinds. As I've emphasized, for example, the moral, religious, and philosophical values that people accept also belong eo ipso to those people's cultures. In arguing that culture is nevertheless not a normative category in the same sense that morality and religion are, my point is simply that the fact that something is part of a culture does not itself confer any normative authority on it, even for those who belong to the culture. After all, many things can be part of a culture, including, for example, not only social norms, but also patterns of deviation from those norms. So the mere fact that something is a feature of a culture to which one belongs does not confer any normative authority on it, nor is it ordinarily seen as so doing. Instead, people respond to perceived values, ideals, and principles, when they do, as values, ideals, and principles, and not as features of culture. In the same spirit, my contention is not that we should ignore the values, ideals, and principles that the members of a culture espouse, but rather that we should assess the significance of those values and ideals as such, instead of supposing that what gives them their normative character is the fact that they are part of a culture. The implication of my argument, then, is not that all of the political claims advanced under the heading of cultural rights or cultural preservation should automatically be dismissed, but rather that those claims should be redescribed in such a way as to make clear the values, ideals, and principles that are at stake. Very often, I believe, these will turn out to be moral, religious, or philosophical values or ideals, so that the appeal to culture will turn out to have been redundant. Occasionally, the values or ideals in question may be ones that cannot naturally be subsumed under the heading of moral, religious, or philosophical values, in which case it's the weight and significance of these new values, rather than their status as features of the culture, that needs to be assessed. Finally, it may in some cases turn out that there was really no value at all at stake, and that the appeal to culture was sheer bluff, that it was simply an appeal to the brute fact that some people behave in a certain way, which by itself has no normative force. In cases of all three kinds, I believe, the elimination of the language of culture will have proven salutary. Let me conclude, finally, by apologizing for having gone on so long, and also by acknowledging the obvious fact that my discussion has been very abstract and has provided little specific guidance about how societies should organize themselves to accommodate new immigrants. I've argued that in thinking about the challenges of immigration, excessive reliance on the discourse of culture and identity has produced distortions and oversimplifications both in the theoretical literature and in popular debates. Clearly, framing the challenges in other terms will not by itself make them disappear. But the unsatisfactory description of a problem may place obstacles in the way of understanding, and may make the shape of possible solutions harder to discern. For that reason, I've tried to warn against some ways of thinking about the problems of immigration that seem to me unhelpful or worse. Thank you.
There's time for some questions and comments. Alistair?
Thank you for that, fascinating, very thought-provoking talk. I have a question about one of the things you were saying concerning the asymmetry between between what you might think of as a state's preservation of sort of the national culture and immigrants' preservation of their culture, and you pointed out quite rightly and perceptively that the national culture, in as much as we can make sense of that phrase, is at least partly constituted by the laws and the language and all these things about these sort of pre-existing conditions of a nation. What you said was that one of the things that the nation owes to the host nation owes to the immigrants is to treat them justly, and one of the desiderata is that that whatever laws the nation might have should not, I think you said, sort of place sort of undue burdens on a particular sort of group of immigrants themselves. And so I'm wondering if you think there's a significance to a distinction that there might be between laws that happen to place undue burdens on a group and laws that are designed to place undue burdens. So, for example, let's say that there is a law, a pre-existing law that men should not wear skirts without wearing underwear, right? And I come to this country as a Scottish immigrant. It's a quarter of me is Scottish, and let's say this places a sort of burden on me because the Scots, of course, enough said. Now, I mean, there might be a difference between the situation. I mean, I'm wondering if you think there's a difference in a situation in which, this was a pre-existing law. A host nation sort of didn't know what these crazy Scotsmen were. The Scotsmen arrived, and they fall foul of this law. Versus a situation where a host nation thinks, a bunch of Scotsmen want to immigrate. Now, we don't actually have this law in the books, but we kind of approve it anyway. So let's pass a law that says, men wearing skirts have to wear underwear. Would you perceive a sort of a difference in those situations? One where the law sort of already exists, and it so happens that what Scotsmen do is going to be outlawed, or a case where the law is passed sort of specifically to burden.
Well, I have to say, Alistair, I read a fair amount of the literature on sort of multiculturalism and national identity and so on. This particular example is not one that I had previously come across, but
I didn't want to explain any particular passion,
well, I don't know. Yes, well, I don't know whether you've succeeded, but look, certainly a law that's passed for the specific purpose of placing a burden on a particular group of immigrants is presumptively unjust. Could a pre-existing law enacted for other reasons also be unjust because it just happened to burden immigrants, though that was never the intent? Yes, it could be. It could be unjust for that reason. I'm not sure that this is a case in which it arguably would.
We think there's a separate value to the effect that Scotsmen should wear underwear.
No, I think that the question is, in thinking about whether such a law, presuming now the case where it's not passed with the intent of burdening Scotsmen, in thinking about whether the fact that it does burden them is unjust, the question would be, what's at stake for Scotsmen in being able to maintain this practice? If, as I suspect, the answer is that it's not a matter of high principle or an important moral value at stake, my inclination would be to say the law's okay. Scotsmen just have to deal with it. But maybe I'm missing something about the significance of this in Scottish culture. I defer to your explanation about that.
It does, though, connect with one of the points you made, which is that when people have, you said that when people sort of have values that are associated with their culture, they think that the value is sort of justified in itself. They don't think it's justified because it's part of the culture. And although I'm sympathetic with that view as a normative view, I think as a descriptive account that's not. I mean, that's not true. I mean, I think I've met many people who say it's important for me to do this because that's the way we do it. Not, now, I mean, maybe that's just a silly thing to
No, I think that phrase, "that's the way we do it," needs to be unpacked. I don't think you can just let that pass. I think it means different things at different times, and that's part of precisely my argument. The point of it is to put some pressure on that comment. What do we mean when we say that's the way we do it? Sometimes we mean that these are our values, and this is something we believe in, and this is a matter of conviction for us and a matter of principle. And that's one kind of case, and I want to insist on distinguishing that kind of a case from another kind of case where it just means this is the way we do it. This is the style of clothing that we happen to wear, where it's not a matter of principle or there's no clear value at stake. It's a matter of, in effect, social habit. And as far as social habit is concerned, people, in a free society, people should have the freedom to maintain their social habits within the usual constraints. It seems to me. I mean, it seems to me that if that's what we do is just adverting to the brute fact that we are accustomed to behaving in this way, that doesn't carry a lot of weight. It doesn't carry a lot of weight, assuming there's a legitimate interest in passing a law in the first place, which there may very well not be, for independent reasons for anyone, the sort of Brian Barry type point, that maybe it's not a good law for anybody. But I think that we have a long constitutional tradition of thinking about people's conscientious convictions and the things that they object to doing in the name of their conscientious convictions and values. And it's a tradition with a lot of internal controversy, and it's like any other tradition. It's always being shaped and reshaped within a living society. But we have a history, and that's the whole point of liberalism. We have a history of thinking about what to do when people's conscientious convictions and beliefs clash. And I think that a lot of these cultural cases can be unpacked in those terms. That's what they are. But if it's not that, if what's at stake is just, we do it this way, then that's a very different kind of case, and it gets less weight. And one of the things I object to about the language of culture is that it obscures this distinction. It lumps together as cultural, as if that were a special sort of magical category, both the familiar things, moral principles, religious values, philosophical outlooks, and matters of brute social practice. And it seems to me it's very important to be able to distinguish them. We cannot treat all differences of brute social practice as if they were matters of high principle.
Right. It's a great talk. I followed it all the way through, which is not normal. So as far as I could hear, most of the analysis was kind of at the level of the nation state, and I'm wondering whether and to what degree the analysis is generalizable to other smaller political bodies, such as individual states or provinces, cities, counties, things like that, or even non-political associations, where usually much of the identity is formed by being able to exclude people from participating who don't share certain things. And I'm wondering, do you see the analysis as being continuous between the nation state and smaller political bodies up to a certain point at least? And if not, why would the asymmetry kind of creep up or enter in there at some point?
Well, I do think it carries over to smaller political entities, but I would say that I want to restrict it to political entities. I mean, it's an argument about it's an argument against defining people in cultural terms for political purposes. So there's separate questions about what should be allowed for other forms of groups and non-political groups and associations and what their legitimate bases may be for excluding or including, what criteria of membership they may legitimately have. But I was objecting to the assignment of political status on the basis of cultural affiliation. And that would apply at sub-federal levels in a federal system or at provincial levels or whatever it is, as well as to the state as a whole.
Charge?
In the earlier part of the talk, the thrust of your argument was that preservationism is largely a lost cause. Not a lost cause, but there are limits to what can be hoped for. Once a group of immigrants is in the country, of course their culture will change because it's challenged by the culture of the host country. Similarly, the culture of the host country will be changed by the arrival of the immigrants. So preservation, the idea of keeping things as they are, is a non-starter. And so the issue shifts over to issues of justice. Now, that seems right to me once the immigrants are in, but of course a prior decision is which immigrants to let in. And I would think that for those with preservationist impulses, this is where the action is, because there will be, some groups whose traditions are sort of continuous with or analogous to the traditions of the host country, and letting them in isn't going to be so much of a challenge to those traditions. And there are other groups who do things very different ways, and they're going to pose lots more challenge. And a committed preservationist really can have a lot of his way by keeping groups of the latter sort out. So I guess my question was, isn't there a big part of the problem that you really haven't talked about? And how far can you go sort of extending the implications of principles of justice to deal with that aspect of the question? Who gets in, who doesn't?
Yeah, well, that's, of course, a great question, and you've put your finger on one of the large issues that I did not discuss, and you're absolutely right. There's a footnote saying I don't discuss this issue. And you've kindly spared me the need to read the footnote. Nothing I've said settles the question, which is really the hard question. I mean, this stuff should be easy. It's not. So people say the things that they say. So there's a point in making the kind of response that I did. But the hard question is, what are the legitimate grounds, if any, for limiting immigration? And in particular, might cultural preservation be one such ground? Now, I did partly mean, at least indirectly, to be undermining one way of supposing that it might be. I mean, if the point is that, look, there's a misguided conception of what counts as cultural preservation anyway. After all, the end result is not that there's no such thing as cultural preservation. The point is that cultural preservation is not incompatible with cultural change. Indeed, it requires it. But not all changes are equal, and somebody might... So if the point of keeping immigrants out is because we're going to keep things exactly the way they are, that's just foolish. And sort of it's based on an incoherent conception of cultural change, and to that extent is discreditable. But suppose somebody said, well, but there's change, and we want to, a big sudden influx of immigrants is going to be much more unsettling to the culture, and so on. Look, the question about limits on immigration is a very hard question. My own view, although I don't have a fixed view about it, I somewhat tend to the view that a world of massive immigration pressure is a world that has other problems, is a world where there's some other kind of injustice or catastrophe or something going on. It may have persecution and oppression. It may have enormous economic inequalities. It probably has a combination of the two. It's got other problems, and that by the time if you've got massive immigration problem, it's almost too late to solve this question. Well, what's our obligation to take people? In a way, because then you're designing a policy of the second best, really. Why is there this massive immigration pressure? If there isn't massive immigration picture, if we imagine a reasonably just world, or as close to it as we could think in non-utopian terms, human beings could ever hope to come, I suspect there'd be much less immigration pressure. And equally, I think that people's could. I don't myself have much of a problem with people excluding immigrants on pretty much whatever reasons they have, even bad reasons. If everybody has a decent place to live where they can make a decent life, and you want to come to my country and I don't want you to because I don't like people named George, that might be ridiculous, but is it an injustice? Well, I don't know. I don't have. In other words, so what I'm saying is that in a just world, the question might be a lot more tractable, a lot easier. In an unjust world, I despair. I'm not sure that there is a defensible position on how many immigrants it's legitimate to accept and on what basis it's legitimate to exclude them. I do think that, I do think that there are certainly considerations about that one might call considerations having to do with the viability of the ongoing collective project that is a country. And I don't think those are largely or even primarily cultural questions. There can be economic issues. They're often cast as cultural issues in ways that I think are pernicious, and that's part of what I was trying to say. But I don't think that the whole idea that the collective project might sort of sink under the weight of truly massive immigration is completely crazy or out of the question. I don't think it's obvious that open borders are what's required, though there's a case to be made for them. But this is all just a way of acknowledging that there's a very large set of questions here that I haven't addressed.
Bill?
Now, I wonder if you could comment on what you have in mind when you talk about the public political culture. I take it that's something more than the Constitution, say, because it's a culture, but it was very abstract, and I'm just wondering what you have in mind. Examples, anyway.
The public political culture would also include the constitutionally established branches of government and their traditions and histories and the traditions of interpreting the founding texts of the Constitution and so on. So I think the entire legal and political, the history of our legal and political institutions constitutes the core of the public political culture, and those things exert enormous weight. They help to structure everyday life, and they give rise to they give the United States a distinctive public political culture, and every other country's got some analog. So it's not a precise notion, and I don't know how to make it precise, but that's the sort of thing I had in mind. So, for example, I would think that Supreme Court decisions belong to the public political culture. Acts of Congress belong to the public political culture. The institutions themselves and their traditions belong to the public political culture.
These sound like laws and institutions
Yes.
and decisions and things.
And the practices that grow up around them.
Right. Okay. So say attitudes towards. I think of perhaps attitudes towards democratic voting and towards the outcomes of democratic elections.
Yes.
that when you start talking about that sort of stuff, you're talking more about attitudes and cultural matters rather than just the fixed legal structures. The way we deal with them as people. But I'm thinking there may be an important area in there to preserve or worry about that goes beyond just the legal structures, but includes more. But I thought there might be some interesting things to say, but I'm not sure what they are.
Yeah, well, it's suggestive. I agree. I mean, but I wasn't thinking of this. I wasn't thinking of it so much as the public political culture as something we might set out to preserve. I was thinking that as long as we have the institutions of a government that we have to have, something worth calling a public political culture will trail along in its wake. I mean, there's really no way of avoiding it. It just is such a massively influential thing, the state, that it will give rise to its own associated practices and traditions and so on. And even if we didn't want to preserve it, as long as we had the institution, we could change it, but we're going to have something that will play that role. And its inescapability is really what I was trying to get at. And it's because it's inescapable that you can't do without one. It's not really a matter of, you can't do without one and have a functioning society.
I would have thought it was something you had to preserve, maybe, perhaps in the educational system, for example.
Well, you have to preserve the institutions. And you have to do whatever so if the institutions are destabilized through lack of support or whatever, then it could all fall apart. You could have a kind of unraveling of the society. But as long as the society is a going concern, you will have that. And I don't mean to belittle the fact that you may need to do certain things to maintain allegiance to the institutions. And
toward the beginning of your talk, you said that you wanted to take the idea that immigration might pose some serious threats to culture seriously, and in your response to George's question, you hinted at that as well. I'm wondering, do you know of any historical examples, fairly clear-cut examples, where a society was brought down or destroyed by immigration? And not talking like this, the gradual evolution, which, as you point out, I think rightly, is not only unavoidable but necessary, but I'm talking about like a full-scale collapse or the end of a civilization or a culture as a result of immigration.
You
think Rome was immigration as opposed to expansion?
No, I mean the sacking of Rome by.
Okay, well, that's militaristic, right? I presume that's not the sort of immigration you're thinking about.
yeah, I wasn't thinking of imperial conquest as it's immigration of a kind, but hordes of Scotsmen without underwear. Something like that.
Want our freedom.
Right. I saw. What's its name? That movie, Braveheart. Yeah. It's a terrible thing to ask a philosopher for an actual fact. No, I can't think of one, but I wouldn't, place too much weight on that. A country undone just by immigration,
or even substantially, not just by, but where's a big ingredient?
Maybe we could. One last question, and there'll be opportunities to continue the conversation in a second.
In response to his issue, I'd like to pose a situation where it may be morally valid to conclude that we should have no immigration in order to preserve civilization. And my reasoning starts off with the October 06 Scientific American, an article on global warming and mass extinction. I consider it a fundamental new understanding of Earth's previous processes. Combine that with work by your fellow researchers Torn and Hart in Berkeley in projecting temperatures to the end of this century, and you can plausibly, not certainly, not even probably, but at least possibly, conclude that human civilization will be over by the end of the century because of that process. The American society puts out 5 times the global warming gases as the rest of the world. So immigration, people come in, they soon assimilate and begin to put out that level of global warming gases, which in this line of reasoning could have a very detrimental effect on civilization. And so the moral thing to do until America begins to behave more morally is to zero immigration. Your comment.
Well, a simpler solution might be to just stop producing so much pollution. It's an interesting argument for limiting immigration, but as I say, it's a kind of indirect solution to the problem. It seems to me that if what we're worried about is global warming, a much more efficient way to attack the problem will be by just trying to solve that problem directly, rather than, I mean, it's equally an argument against giving birth to new Americans, right? Because nobody should have children because they're just going to grow up to be polluters like us, you know. It has about as much force as that. It has a certain logic to it, but sure. Yeah, forced emigration, right. Yeah, that's right. I think the Swedes might have a thing to say about that. In response to the previous question, where immigration has destroyed, I don't know about a country. I mean, there are the kinds of cases Will Kimlicka talks a lot about where immigration of non-Indians into Indian tribal lands in Canada may sort of undermine the tribes. Now, they are not countries at the moment. They have special sovereignty arrangements. So that's not exactly what you're talking about. It's not, at the present moment, imperialistic. It's not conquest. It's just people going to live, buying up land, that kind of thing, taking part in the political process. Yeah, exactly. And it can undermine ways of life in the same way that gentrification can undermine ways of life. And that stuff goes on all the time.
Same kind of dangerous stuff as all these surgeons coming from other parts of the country and ruining Texas culture in Houston.